Tonight, you are not visiting the Viking world in summer, when the fjords glitter and the ships seem almost graceful on the water. You are arriving in the dead center of winter, when the land is less a landscape than a condition of endurance. The cold is not scenery here. It is not a mood. It is not even exactly weather. It is a patient living pressure that studies every weak joint in a door, every gap in a roof, every threadbare patch in a cloak, every tiredness in a household, and waits. It does not shout. It seeps. It settles into leather, into water buckets, into beard hair, into the undersides of benches, into a child's cough in the dark. It moves by inches and by nights, and it is always listening for the small mistake that makes the rest of the winter easier for itself. You wake in that world before the light has properly arrived. For one long moment, you do not move. You only feel the rough weight of wool over your shoulders. The heat trapped under furs that smell of lanolin, smoke, and sleep. The shape of another body close beside you, not by affection, not exactly, but by necessity. Someone's foot is tucked against your calf. Someone's elbow presses lightly into your ribs. A sleeping child farther down the shared platform lets out one high, whistling breath through a blocked nose, and then settles again. Somewhere beyond the inner partition, an animal shifts in straw. Somewhere near the center of the longhouse, you hear the soft crackle of a fire that did not die in the night. That sound, more than anything, tells you that morning is possible. The darkness in a Viking longhouse is never quite empty. Even before dawn there are gradients, a reddish blink where embers breathe under ash, a dim silver seam where the door leaks the outside into the house. Black beams above you, barely visible, crisscrossing like the ribs of a ship turned upside down. The roof holds snow. You cannot see it, but you can feel its muffling effect. The world outside is buried, pressed flat, silent under weight. The world inside is cramped, sour, warm at the center, and cold at the edges, and utterly full of life. You draw one hand from beneath the blanket, and at once regret it. The air above the shared bedding is sharp enough to sting the skin. Cold lives in layers here. There is the cold inside the room, which is survivable. The colder air gathered higher up under the roof, the draft near the walls, the bite of the floor. And then, beyond all that, the outside cold. The real cold, the cold that makes people humble. You tuck your hand back under the wool and breathe into the space near your mouth, warming it with your own breath. For another minute, you stay where you are. No one in the house mistakes speed for strength in winter. You move when you must, not before. This is one of the first Viking methods for staying alive, though no one would have bothered to phrase it that way. Conserve warmth, conserve motion, conserve effort until effort becomes necessary. A hard season teaches economy not only of food and fuel, but of the body itself. Even waking is done carefully here. Eventually someone does have to move. The old woman nearest the hearth sits up first. She has probably done this thousands of times through thousands of gray mornings. She swings her legs down, wraps a cloak around her shoulders without ever fully exposing herself to the room's colder air, and crosses to the center fire with the low, stubborn patience of a person who knows the day cannot begin until the embers are persuaded back to life. You watch her stir the ash with a stick. At first nothing seems to happen. Then a faint orange pulse appears beneath the powdery gray. Then another. She lays on bark, dried moss, a few thin twigs. She bends, breathes, waits. The flame catches without ceremony. Everyone notices, even those pretending still to sleep. The longhouse is a machine for surviving winter, but it is not a polished one. It is earthy and smoky and heavy, with things that would look ugly anywhere except exactly where they are needed. The walls are thickened with turf, packed earth, moss, straw, and whatever else the household had to hand when the building was raised and repaired again. The roof pitches low and broad. not to look elegant but to keep the weather sliding off or settling in useful ways. Snow itself becomes insulation once it gathers. The doorway is smaller than comfort would prefer, and stronger than vanity would choose. There are no wide windows opening the house to wasted beauty. Light is expensive in winter. Warmth costs more. The whole structure is built around what must be kept in and what must be kept out. Along the walls are benches that are also beds, beds that are also storage, storage that is also memory. Beneath the place where you slept, there may be tools, spare rope, dried fish, an extra skin, a cracked bowl kept, because cracked is not the same thing as useless. Above your head hang herbs, bits of twine, a ladle, perhaps a child's small mitten put there to dry and forgotten overnight. Nothing in the room belongs to only one purpose. That, too, is a method. In a hard place, survival means asking every object to justify itself twice. The fire now gives enough light for faces to appear. A man near the far wall rubs his eyes and coughs into his hand. A younger girl reaches for a spindle even before breakfast, more from habit than duty. Two boys argue silently with each other through shoves, because neither wants to be the first to step onto the cold floor. A dog has somehow made itself a nest beneath the bench and resents the day for finding it there. The room smells of wool, old smoke, damp leather, stored grain, bodies, and the faint clean bitterness of pine resin someone threw on the coals late last night. It is not a smell anyone outside this culture would call beautiful, but it smells like held-off death, and that counts for a great deal. A pot is hung, water goes in, then barley. Breakfast begins in the patient way all winter food begins, by accepting simplicity. A Viking winter meal is rarely about surprise. Surprise means unplanned abundance, and unplanned abundance is not a thing the North hands out easily. The porridge thickens, steam curls upward, and vanishes into the dim air above. One by one people approach with bowls. No one complains that it is the same as yesterday, because yesterday it was also warm, and warmth is not a meal that becomes tiresome. You finally rise. The boards and packed earth beneath your feet send the cold straight up your legs. The room is warmer at the center than at the edges, and warmer lower down than high up, which is why the roof sits so close, and the beams hang low enough to make tall men stoop. Heat should not be allowed to drift uselessly into empty space. Even the house knows this. Dressing in winter is less like putting on clothes and more like constructing yourself. First the undergarment, rough against the skin but not wet, which is all you can ask. Then the heavier tunic, then woolen leg wraps or trousers. Then the stockings, repaired so many times that the repair itself has become the garment's true identity. Boots come next. They are stiff with cold, and the leather needs a moment by the fire before it remembers it was once skin and not wood. Someone has stuffed them with straw to keep their shape and absorb damp. The straw smells dry, sweet, almost like late summer remembered from a great distance. Then comes the cloak, the real wall between you and the season. If you have a good one, it is dense and heavy enough to alter how the wind approaches you. If you have a poor one, you wear it anyway and trust layering to do what luxury cannot. Wool matters more than almost anything here. Wool keeps warmth when other fibers surrender. Wool can be mended, felted, patched, turned, smoked, aired, and worn again. Wool is memory transformed into protection. Somewhere in this house, someone spent long autumn evenings spinning the fleece that now keeps your shoulders from stiffening in the yard. That is another Viking method for staying alive. Treat textile work as life work. The thread passing through a woman's fingers near the hearth is not secondary labor. It is shelter made portable. A finished pair of socks in this world is not a small domestic accomplishment. It is circulation preserved. To modern eyes, spinning may look quiet, decorative, even quaint. In a northern winter, spinning is as serious as carpentry. You pin your cloak, pull up a hood, find mittens that do not quite match. Nothing matches perfectly in a working household by deep winter. One mitten might belong to a dead uncle. The other might have been recut from an older pair after the cuff tore. A bootlace may be newer than the boot. A child may be wearing a better cap than a grown man because the household judged correctly that small ears are lost faster than pride. Winter redistributes vanity according to practical need. Outside the door, the weather waits exactly as you feared it would. The first rush of cold through the opening feels almost physical, like striking water or a wall of moving glass. The yard is white and blue and pale silver under a sky that has not fully decided to become day. Snow lies high against the outer wall. Paths have been cut through it by repeated use, narrow corridors of packed hardness leading toward the byre. The woodpile, the pit where something was stored before the ground froze solid, the edge of the yard where old fences vanish under drifting snow. Every place the household still needs has been argued back from winter, a little, step by repeated step. The animals are already breathing steam into the morning. A cow turns its head and watches you with the grave indifference of a creature that understands cold perfectly and has no interest in your opinion of it. Goats complain because complaining is their principal philosophy. Their heat matters more than their manners. In some houses, the animals are near enough to the living quarters that the transfer of body warmth is part of the building's design. In others, they are only separated by walls thinner than anyone would prefer. Either way, the Viking household does not draw a clean sentimental line between human comfort and animal presence. A warm animal is future milk, future meat, future trade, and present heat. That is enough to make it beloved, whether or not anyone says so. You carry feed, break the skin of ice in a trough, kick packed snow away from a threshold, clear enough space for movement, check a latch, listen for the ordinary sounds of health. Winter teaches people to listen with frightening accuracy. A cough in a child, a silence in an animal, a change in how the roof takes the wind. Everything can matter. The body learns this kind of listening, because the season punishes those who delay too long in understanding what has changed. And then, before the cold can work its slow trick on your fingers, you go back in. The return is its own luxury. The door closes, the room receives you with smoke, heat, and the familiar smell of everyone else's continued existence. Your face stings, your hands ache. Someone wordlessly takes the bucket from you. Someone else pushes a stool closer to the fire with a foot. Care in the Longhouse does not often arrive wrapped in speeches. It arrives in useful motions that may be one of the softest things about this world. When your fingers have half thawed, you eat again, not much, not yet. A piece of coarse bread, a little more porridge. Perhaps a bit of last season's cheese if the household can spare it. Winter eating is constant, not because the table is lavish, but because the body burns through itself more quickly in cold. Calories are fuel in the least metaphorical way: barley, beans, preserved fish, mutton, dairy, roots. These are the true winter treasures. A jar of butter hidden toward the back of storage may shine in a household's imagination more brightly than silver. By midday, a richer pot may be on, salted meat softened into stew, turnips, onions, perhaps cabbage, if anything of that sort lasted and did not rot. A little rendered fat, melting across the top into iridescent circles that make even the sternest face look relieved. You learn quickly that fat is not a garnish in winter. It is strategy. It is interior insulation. It is the body's closest answer to the weather's long insult. The household stores food everywhere, and in every form it can manage. Dried fish hanging from rafters, salted cuts buried in barrels, roots stored in cool, dark places, grain sealed against damp and mice, butter kept where it can be guarded from heat and greed alike. Ale brewed because water is unreliable, and because fermentation makes life marginally kinder. Everything here tastes partly of planning. Every meal contains the memory of labor, done in a better season for the sake of this worse one. You notice how everyone measures without seeming to measure. How the eldest woman's eyes track the ladle. How a man splitting hard bread automatically counts the pieces. How children are corrected not when they eat, but when they waste. Scarcity is not always dramatic. Often it simply lives in habits so old, they stop looking like fear. That is another Viking method for staying alive. Teach the body to use carefully before desperation arrives. After eating, the room does not relax exactly. Winter allows very little true idleness. Instead, the energy of the house changes shape. Spindles begin to turn. A broken strap is punched and stitched. A knife is sharpened. A basket is rebound. A child is set to untangling wool from a clump, because even a child's impatience can be converted into utility if the task is small enough. Craft work rises naturally out of the season, because field work has been forced inward. The room becomes a workshop held inside a breathing animal of wood and turf and smoke. You sit with a pile of wool in your lap and help pick out burrs, or perhaps with a torn cuff and a needle, or perhaps scraping old grease from a harness strap so it can be treated again. The precise task matters less than the rhythm, hands moving, fire speaking low, light shifting slightly across the central aisle. The dog asleep beneath the bench, the pot sometimes stirred, sometimes ignored, then stirred again. In this way, time passes without making the winter larger. This too is a method. Occupy the mind through the hands. A season of too much dark and too little movement can easily make thought turn inward and sour. Work protects against that. It need not be heroic, only repetitive enough to keep dread from becoming the room's loudest voice. Still, winter has ways of entering the mind. The darkness is not only outside, it has a psychological texture all its own. Days are reduced to a few gray hours. Sometimes even those vanish into snow haze. Sleep frays. People wake in the middle of the night and do not know whether to call it night or morning. The sun becomes rumor, then memory, then a thing measured in hope rather than sight. In the farthest north, this effect is worse. The world becomes a prolonged twilight held together by fire and custom. You begin to understand how much of human confidence depends on light once light is withheld long enough. The room seems quieter, faces are paler, eyes linger on the fire too long. A child rocks absently while staring at nothing. Two men argue about whether it is wise to risk a journey tomorrow. But what they are really arguing about is whether motion might keep the gloom from hardening completely inside the house. The Vikings had no modern word for seasonal depression. That does not mean they escaped it. They simply met it with the tools they had. Activity, ritual, community, alcohol, storytelling, and the stubborn refusal to let darkness be the only thing shaping the mood of the room. Someone brings out polished pieces of stone or crystal and holds them toward what little light enters, half from curiosity, half from habit. You have heard stories of sunstones, of crystals that can catch the sky and suggest where the hidden sun truly sits beyond cloud or haze. Whether every household trusted such things is almost beside the point. Winter makes symbolic objects useful, even when their function is partly emotional. To hold a stone and say the sun is still there somewhere is not foolish in a long season. It is medicine of a kind. As evening comes, the fire becomes more than a tool again. It becomes the house's visible pulse. Someone banks part of it. Someone feeds another part. Resin may be tossed on, and for a moment the room smells not of smoke and tallow and old wool, but of sharp pine sweetness. That change alone can lift the heart. Firelight moves over bowls, over fingers, over carved posts, over the faces of people who have spent too many weeks studying only each other and the weather. You see then why the hearth came to mean more than warm. It organizes the room, yes, it cooks the food, dries the clothes, revives numb hands, but it also holds the household's mood in place. The dark around the edges of the longhouse feels less interested in entering, when the fire is attended properly. Some would call this sacred, others would call it sensible. In a Viking winter, the distinction is often too small to matter. Night gathers fully, the room contracts around the hearth. This is when the stories begin. The old man who tells them smells of smoke and old leather, and the sort of clean cold that lingers in cloth after a day outside. He does not have to raise his voice. A good storyteller in a winter house lets the room lean toward him of its own accord. He begins with a familiar saga, or perhaps only a fragment of one. A voyage, a feud, a boast made too early and paid for too late. The names move through the house like embers carried on air. Some are famous, some belong only to this household's memory. A child hearing them for the first time sits very still. An older woman mouths certain lines before he does, not to interrupt, but because the story lives in her too. Stories are another real method for staying alive. They give shape to time. They stop the dark from becoming formless. They remind the living that other winters were endured, other bad decisions made, other losses outlived. A saga can make hardship feel purposeful for an hour. It can also make the room laugh, which is nearly as important. Viking humor is not delicate. It is dry, sharp, practical, sometimes cruel, often deeply satisfying. Someone in the tale makes a fool of himself. Someone insults the wrong person brilliantly. Someone survives not through size or strength, but through nerve and timing. The room warms from that almost as much as from the fire. Then, the stories bend, as winter stories do, toward the strange. A man buried improperly, a dead thing that would not stay put, a spirit that presses on the chest of sleepers until they wake choking, a being in the dark whose intentions are guessed first by animals, then by children, and only last by men confident enough to think themselves rational. No one listens with disbelief sharpened into contempt. That would be a luxury of safer climates, in a season where every unusual sound matters. The unseen remains plausible longer. So the Draugr enters the room, not in body, but in narrative. A corpse filled with sea-cold hatred, a dead person swollen with wrongness. The old man describes it without hurrying, the household shivers without interrupting. Someone checks the door bar though it was checked already. Someone else reaches up and touches a charm hanging from a beam. Fear becomes bearable when given a story and a sequence. The thing came, the door held, the rites were done, the danger passed or did not pass. But in either case it had edges. This is why myth belongs to winter, not because people are less sensible in the cold, but because they are more aware of what they cannot control. Spirits, ancestors, Draugr, omens, house wights, luck, tata. These are all ways of speaking to the part of reality that does not answer to skill alone. A good roof matters, a good cloak matters, but a sudden illness, a cow lost, a drift collapsing the wrong way, a child failing to wake. These things can make any household humble enough to leave a bowl of food by the door and call it wisdom rather than fear. In the rafters above hang little confirmations of this worldview. Now. Dried herbs, perhaps, carved pieces of wood, a bone tied with cord, an old charm no one remembers making, but no one dares throw away. A post near the high seat bears marks worn by decades of hands. Maybe there are stories that ancestor relics once rested in such posts. Maybe not. The post still feels inhabited by memory in winter. Memory and presence become difficult to separate. You lie awake later that night and hear something shift above the beams. It may be snow settling, it may be wood responding to cold, it may be nothing at all, but after an evening of stories, nothing loses some of its confidence as an explanation. You pull the blanket closer. A person sleeping beside you turns and accidentally gives you more warmth than comfort. You take the warmth. That is what winter teaches. Take the warmth. Leave interpretation for spring, morning again, or something like it. The Longhouse wakes slower after such nights, breath clouds, Ash is stirred. Porridge returns. Life continues because it must. That continuity is perhaps the most astonishing part of winter survival. The household can listen to stories of the dead walking and still spend the next hour mending boots. Fear is folded into routine until routine makes it manageable. Today there is travel to be done, a parcel of preserved fat or herbs. Or perhaps a message must go to another farm. Winter does not abolish obligation, so you dress again in all of the same layers, appreciating now that repetition is itself a form of mercy. There is no need to invent yourself each morning. You simply build a body suitable for the day and step into it. The journey out is harder than the chores. Paths vanish under fresh snow. Wind lifts crystals of ice into your face. The horse pulling the sledge lowers its head and keeps moving with the fatalistic competence of a creature that knows this argument well. If the household has skis, those too may appear. Long curved boards with bindings of leather and will. Skis in the Viking world are not recreation. They are winter translated into motion. To move well across snow is almost divine in such a place. There are stories enough to prove that people noticed. You go through woods that are so still, they seem to be listening back. Pines hold white on every branch. Ice grips the lower trunks. The sound of travel is reduced to runners over packed snow. Breath, the occasional low word, and the distant crack of some burdened limb giving way under weight. The sky remains a blank pale shield overhead. With enough miles of this, the world becomes dreamlike. The color narrows, your thoughts simplify, move, breathe. Keep circulation. Follow the person ahead. Trust the path because there is no better option. When you reach another household, the fire at their center feels miraculous, even though it is no different from yours. Hospitality in winter is one of the North's most serious ethics. To receive a frozen traveler is to participate in the same system that may one day save your own people. Gloves come off, ale is offered, a place by the warmth is made, news is exchanged. The parcel is delivered, people speak more softly than they might in summer, as if the weather outside has disciplined even their voices. The journey home is worse because returning always asks more of the body than setting out. Fatigue enters, damp from breath, and melted frost cools inside the cloak. Your toes begin to disappear into numbness if you do not move them deliberately. Rage becomes useful, so does memory. You picture the longhouse. The bench, the smell of the fire, the bowl that will be in your hands if you make it back. This is another method. Think in returns, not in distances. And then at last the house appears. Smoke, roofline, the small dark certainty of a door. There are few sights in the world more comforting than a known shelter after too much white. Inside, the thawing hurts. The pain in your fingers is so sharp it feels almost insulting. But then the bowl arrives, then the stool, then the fur over your shoulders, then the fire, returned safe, as a softer age might call it. Here, it is simply called evening. It is on evenings like this that the longhouse feels less like a building and more like a shared organism. Steam rises from wet hems, boots line up by the hearth. The room fills again with small, useful sound. Someone trims meat. Someone checks a child's cracked knuckles and rubs fat into them. Someone else leans back against a post and closes their eyes without fully sleeping. You realize then that community itself is one of the greatest Viking winter methods for staying alive. Not because people are always kind, they are not. They grow tired, irritable, cramped, bored, suspicious. But because they are there, other hands, other backs, other heat sources, other memories, other watchers of the fire, no one could sustain a northern winter completely alone for long. Even the stories that praise lone endurance do so from inside cultures that knew better. Solitude in summer might mean freedom. Solitude in deep winter can become an argument with silence that silence almost always wins. The house keeps people alive because it keeps them from vanishing into their own cold. That is why Yule matters so much when it finally arrives. It does not arrive like a modern holiday, neat and decorative. It arrives like release under pressure. You sense it before the first feast bowl is filled. The room is cleaner, better garments are taken down and brushed, a little more fuel is allowed to vanish into a larger flame. The household's mood brightens in ways that have nothing to do with weather. Better ale comes out, better meat, better memory, song returns with more confidence. Even laughter seems to take up more space in the room, as if the dark itself is being pushed back foot by foot. Yule is not denial of winter, it is defiance against surrendering the season your full spirit. Offerings may be made, a toast to ancestors, a word to gods. A little ale spilled deliberately where the earth cannot quite receive it. A bowl set by the threshold, a prayer spoken with enough drink in it that prayer and confidence become difficult to separate. The point is not theological precision, the point is reaffirming connection. Children who have spent weeks under winter's discipline become wild around the edges. Old men sing too loudly. Women who measure grain with severity at ordinary meals allow themselves the pleasure of giving second portions. Someone recites a heroic passage and forgets half the lines and invents the rest. No one cares, the room is brighter than usual, and that brightness alone feels almost shocking. In such a night, survival becomes celebration instead of merely a private relief. And because this is still a human world, not a carved ideal, tenderness grows more visible too. Hands remain touching a little longer after a cup is passed. A cloak is adjusted on another's shoulders. Two people slip toward the outer bench where shadows are kindest. A child falls asleep upright against an aunt not truly related by blood, but by winters endured together. Yule lets affection step into the light, because the whole house has agreed, for once, not to spend every breath measuring loss. After Yule, the room does not transform magically. The same walls stand, the same chores wait, the same weather often continues with insulting determination. But something subtle changes in the emotional grain of the house. People move with a little more faith in the year's ability to turn. This is no small thing. Hope, in a Viking winter, is not sentiment. It is fuel. Days pass. More work, more meals, more smoke, more small arguments and reconciliations. But then one noon, a drip sounds from the roofline near the door. Then another. No one speaks at first because naming hope too early feels dangerous. Yet everyone hears it. Water, actual moving water, a patch of snow near the threshold darkens and settles. The dog comes back muddier than before. A child laughs at nothing more than the sight of wet earth. The world has not softened yet. Not truly. But it has started to loosen. Animals know before people fully trust it. They shift differently. They nose the air. Their sounds change. The yard grows complicated with thaw, which is its own danger. Ice beneath slush, mud where certainty was, rotted snow bridges. But nobody curses the mud, very sincerely. Mud means the cold has lost its clean total power. Mud means another kind of labor is coming. And another kind of labor means continuity beyond this room. You begin to notice light lingering. Not much, just enough to disturb habit. The longhouse door opens longer before someone shouts to close it. Blankets are carried out and beaten. Tools meant for the field, rather than the fire, are checked with more interest. Someone speaks of a boat without sounding like a dreamer. Somewhere beneath the yard, beneath the old drifts and hard ruts, the land is preparing to remember itself. And when that happens, when thaw begins in earnest, you understand at last the full shape of Viking winter survival. But before the thaw can truly claim the season, winter makes everyone prove themselves a little longer. There are still storms. There is still the work of waking to a world that has not yet softened enough to trust. One night the wind rises after dark with a violence that feels personal. It pushes at the walls in long, furious bursts. then circles, and comes again from another direction, as if searching for the weakest seam. The whole house listens. That is what people do in bad weather. They listen first. The roof answers with low creaks. Snow hits the outer turf in dry, rushing waves. Somewhere a loose piece of wood knocks a rhythm no one likes. Nobody says the word fear. Fear is too obvious a guest in winter to require introduction. Instead, the house rearranges itself around the weather. Someone checks the door bar. Someone adds to the fire, not because the room is cold yet, but because this is not the sort of night on which you allow the center to shrink. An older man ties down a hanging bundle that has started swaying in the drafts. A woman wakes the heavier sleepers nearest the outer wall and tells them to pull the bedding farther in from the edges. Children are moved without being fully woken. Even the dog changes position and places itself closer to the middle of the room. This is another method for staying alive. One the cold teaches almost better than hunger does. When danger grows, the household contracts. It does not scatter into separate private reactions. It narrows toward the center and begins making practical corrections in silence. You spend a while that night feeding the fire in turns with the others. No one wastes words. Logs are passed hand to hand. Ashes shifted. A little vent is adjusted. The smoke behaves badly for a time, and then better. Outside, the storm continues, trying to become a force large enough to matter more than the house. Inside, the house refuses. By dawn the weather has spent itself against the walls and drifted on, leaving the yard changed, the paths buried, and everyone in the room more tired than frightened. Morning after a storm has its own strange beauty. The light is pale and clean. Snow is banked high against every surface. Familiar things have become unfamiliar in shape. A fence looks like a sleeping beast. A woodpile resembles a grave mound. The path to the animals must be cut again from scratch. Your arms ache by the time the first narrow trench is made. Breath streams around every face. Nobody enjoys this work. Yet there is something almost peaceful in it once the danger has passed. The storm tried. The house held. Now the household does what it always does. It resumes. Resuming is one of the least celebrated and most important survival skills in history. The days after a storm are often for repair. Snow is brushed from roof edges where weight gathered too thick. Any place the turf shifted is checked. Frozen leather is warmed and rubbed with fat. Harness is inspected. A split stave in a bucket is bound tighter. A bent peg is replaced. A latch that worked poorly in the wind is carved again until it sits true. Winter reveals weaknesses by force, and the wise household thanks it in the only way that matters, by fixing what it exposed before the next weather comes. You spend one whole gray afternoon helping mend the roof from inside. Not a full rebuilding, only the constant little negotiations that keep a longhouse from becoming a ruin. Someone stands on a bench and presses fresh packing into a seam where the draft proved too eager. Someone else passes up moss dried near the fire for just this purpose. A younger boy holds a bowl of clay mix and tries not to spill it while staring too hard at the smoke hole above. You work with cold fingers and warm breath, and for a while the whole room smells not only of smoke and food, but of fresh earth brought indoors to keep winter outdoors. There is something deeply right about that later, when the roof has been persuaded into loyalty again, the household turns to light. Fire's the main light of winter, but not the only one. Tallow matters, wick matters, small lamps matter. Even reflected light matters in a season that withholds brightness like a grudge. You watch fat being rendered slowly into something more useful than food alone. The smell is not romantic. Nothing about household tallow work is romantic. Yet the little finished lights, once set aside to cool, carry a surprising comfort. A lamp that can burn after the fire is banked is a small extension of daylight, and in late winter small extensions feel enormous. A woman near the wall twists fibers into wick while speaking so softly you almost miss the words. She's not telling a formal story, She is simply remembering aloud a winter from years before. When a different house, on a different farm, went 3 days with almost no dry wood, and had to live by one guttering lamp and a bed of buried embers. The memory is told not as tragedy, but as instruction. That is another quiet, Viking method for staying alive. Experience does not remain locked inside the people who endured it. It is passed along in the same tone used for recipes, weather signs, and animal births. This is how households become wiser than any one body in them. A. The children absorb all of it while pretending not to listen. In winter, children are not exempt from survival, only assigned smaller versions of it. They twist wool, mind younger siblings, fetch chips of wood too small for adults to bother with, carry bowls carefully from bench to bench, learn where not to step in the dark, learn to put things back where the household expects them. Learn, above all, that a winter house runs on remembered placements. Knife there, bowl there, flint there, dry kindling there, gloves never left by the door, wet stockings never hidden under bedding. A child who learns these things becomes useful much earlier than a child in an easier climate might need to. You notice too how the very old remain part of the winter system. The stooped woman nearest the hearth does not carry logs, but she reads the fire better than anyone. The man whose knees have gone unreliable in the cold no longer clears paths, but he can tell by the sound of the wind whether it will turn before dusk. Another elder remembers who promised what to whom 3 seasons ago, and therefore prevents a quiet feud from igniting in a season when no one can afford extra enemies. Survival is not only muscle, it is memory, judgment, the ability to tell which sound in the night means danger, and which only means weather pretending. And sometimes, despite all preparations, someone gets sick. Illness in winter feels different from illness in the green months. It has less room around it. A cough in summer is a person in a doorway. A cough in winter is a sound that moves through the whole house. When one body grows feverish, every blanket, every bowl, every spoon, every hand suddenly matters more. A wound on a finger that might have been shrugged off in harvest season can become serious when cold slows healing and smoke fills the air. Cracked skin around the knuckles can split deeper than seems reasonable. Feet can rot under damp wrappings, chests can fill. The Vikings were not ignorant of the body, only constrained by what the season and their tools allowed. So there are remedies: broth, rest, honey, if any remains, warm cloths, snow for swelling, boiled water for cleaning, herbs steeped into bitter infusions that promise more than they can always deliver, but deliver enough, sometimes, to remain trusted. Juniper, angelica, willow bark, thyme, whatever the household has stored and remembers how to use. Hands become diagnostic tools, a forehead touched, a pulse felt by custom if not by theory. The line between medicine and caregiving is thin in a winter house. To sit beside the sick and help them drink is treatment. To shift the sleeping arrangements so they lie closer to warmth is treatment. To give them the better share of fat from the stew for a few nights is treatment. This too should count as a Viking method for staying alive. Not a weapon, not a ship, a woman holding a cup to a fevered mouth in the dark. When the sick recover, the whole house becomes lighter by a measure too small for language and too large to miss. When they do not, winter changes shape around the loss. A place by the fire feels vacant. A task goes momentarily undone because the person who always did it is now a story being told softly in the evening. Yet even grief in winter becomes structured by necessity. Wood must still be brought in, food still measured, the children still made to sleep. The dead do not require the living to stop surviving. They require the living to remember while surviving, and that is harder, but also perhaps holier. There are days when the dark seems less dangerous than the closeness. This is another truth the songs rarely celebrate. A winter house can fray tempers as quickly as weather frays rope. Privacy is thin, Hunger sharpens moods, repetition makes small irritations feel ancient. A man chews too loudly, a child kicks in sleep, someone leaves the spoon in the wrong place. Someone takes the dryer cloak without asking. Someone drinks too much at the wrong hour and becomes sentimental or insulting or both. Winter asks people not only to endure the season, but to endure one another under pressure without letting household friction become household ruin. So there are methods for this too. Silence, sometimes, laughter, when possible, sending the angriest person outside with a practical task before their words become damage. Letting elders settle matters before pride hardens. Turning complaint into work, if a pair of hands is cross. Give those hands wood to split, net to mend, snow to clear, a stubborn strap to soften by the fire. No one in the Longhouse has the luxury of nursing rage beautifully for long. Too many people depend on too many small acts of cooperation. One evening, a quarrel does break open, low but sharp, over food, or perhaps over whose family contributed more to the stores, or whether one man has been slower than another to help with the paths. The details hardly matter. What matters is how the room responds. No one pretends the quarrel is impossible. No one panics either. The older woman nearest the fire tells them both to sit. An older man makes a joke rude enough to break the worst of the tension. Someone passes a cup. The matter is not solved in the modern therapeutic sense. It is folded back into the household, because the household is more important than either man's dignity in that moment. That, too, is survival. Some days the weather grants enough mercy for fishing. Not easy fishing, winter fishing, the sort done through holes cut in ice or from dangerous edges where water still moves, black, beneath thin crusts. Fish in winter are not a hobby. They are protein, trade, hope, and proof that the world has not completely shut itself away. The preparations begin indoors. Lines checked, hooks examined, boots dried hard enough to trust, a small stash of better gloves reserved for hands that must work fine movements over freezing water. When at last you go, the cold near open water feels worse than yard cold. It rises through the air with a damp edge that gets inside sleeves and makes the wind feel meaner. The water itself, dark and moving, is almost shocking after so much white stillness. You crouch, wait, listen to the faint little sounds of line and ice and breath. This kind of winter labor teaches a different patience from spinning or mending. Indoors, patience is warm. Here it bites. Yet when a fish does come, silver and furious, and utterly alive against the gray, the thrill moves through the body faster than heat. Food, pulled from the season itself, feels like an argument won. Back at the Longhouse, the fish will be cleaned, shared, perhaps eaten fresh if fortune is especially loose that day, perhaps preserved into tomorrow. Nothing is only for today in winter if it can be made to last. There are days, too, for butchering what could no longer be fed. Winter teaches hard arithmetic. An animal that cannot survive to spring may have to become food for those who can. The work is solemn, not because people are sentimental about it, though they are not unfeeling, but because waste would be obscene. Every part becomes useful where possible. Meat for stew, fat for cooking in lamps, bone for tools, hide for repair, sinew for fastening. Even the smell of slaughter enters the Longhouse with a grim usefulness. This is not abundance, it is conversion, and the Vikings were very good at turning one form of life into several forms of continued living. You sit later with a bowl of marrow-rich broth, and notice how silence deepens when food is especially good. Not because people are reverent exactly, but because the body takes over. The steam rises, the fat shines, bread softens in the broth, and becomes something better than itself. Outside, wind moves over the roof. Inside, for a little while, everyone is too warmed from within to resent much of anything. This repeated return to bodily comfort is what gives the script of winter its right pace. Hardship cannot run uninterrupted in a sleep story any more than it can in life. The house must keep giving you back to the hearth, to the bowl, to the bench, to the hand resting for a moment beside yours while both of you thaw. Later in the season comes a bath day of sorts, if enough fuel and luck permit it. Not luxury, never that, but enough warmed water, enough heated stones, enough privacy arranged imperfectly for people to scrape away some accumulation of winter from skin and hair. Steam lifts from stones. The room chosen for it is closer. Lower, more intimate than comfort really allows, and therefore oddly soothing. Skin reddens, old sweat loosens, lice are found and dispatched with ancient certainty. Hair is combed, cracked heels are inspected. This is not cleanliness for beauty, it is maintenance of the body as a tool that has already survived too much and must be kept going. The relief afterward is difficult to describe, to feel briefly human in a cleaner way, to feel one's scalp breathe, to wear linen or wool that, though far from pristine, is at least recently aired, to lie down that night with less smoke in the hair and less salt on the skin. Such moments can make a whole week gentler. They do not change the weather, but they remind the body it still belongs to the world of touch and care, not only to endurance. Toward the latter half of winter, courtship and arrangement begin moving through the house in more visible ways. This may seem like a strange time for such things, but close quarters and long evenings have always been allies of observation. People see who works well under pressure, who shares food, who helps the elderly, who watches the fire without being asked, who laughs kindly, who grows small and mean in scarcity. These are excellent marriage facts, far better than summer beauty. So a winter household often becomes the place where futures are quietly measured. An older woman remarks on someone's steady hands. A visiting relative asks indirect questions. A younger man offers the dry side of a cloak to a younger woman, and keeps doing so without thinking he is being watched. Everyone is being watched. Winter has time for that, not with malice always. Sometimes with the simple realism of communities that understand marriage as another system of survival. Another web of labor, land, kinship, warmth, and obligation. Romance may live here too, but it lives among practical eyes. You begin to see how even affection is seasonal in its expression. There are no sweeping summer scenes. Instead, there is a cup passed to one person first. A place made on a bench near the warmer side of the hearth. A mitten repaired before the owner notices the tear. Two heads bent over the same strip of leather while everyone else pretends not to see how little work is truly being done. Intimacy in a Viking winter is woven from usefulness and nearness. That is one reason it feels believable. All the while, the sky keeps changing by such slow degrees that only memory can measure it. Light lingers a little longer on one wall of the house. The gray outside becomes, for moments, almost silver. Then one afternoon there is actual color at the horizon, faint and diluted but undeniably there, and the whole household notices without speaking the noticing aloud. The sun has not returned in triumph. It has returned like an embarrassed relative, cautious and late. No one mocks it. They have needed it too much. With returning light come certain rites of re-entry into the wider world. Tools for field and boat are looked at with seriousness again. Nets are checked for real use, not just maintenance. Harness is laid out in a way that suggests future roads rather than present storage. One man speaks of a neighboring farm beyond the worst drifts, and this time the remark sounds less like fantasy. A child is sent farther from the house than before, and comes back with wet boots and a grin so proud it would be absurd if it were not completely understandable. Distance itself is beginning to exist again, yet winter does not surrender cleanly. There is often a last long stretch when the days promise and the nights punish. Melt by noon, hard refreeze by dusk, paths turn treacherous, roofs drip. Mud lies hidden under crusted ice. This in-between season can be more dangerous than the deeper freeze, because it tempts confidence too early. The wise household stays cautious. Extra socks are still dried by the fire, travel is still measured, food is still counted. though with a little less dread now, and a little more calculation about how stores must bridge into growth. You spend one late winter morning clearing not snow but slush from the yard. It is uglier work and somehow happier. Water runs where white had only sat. The shovel cuts through something looser, more mortal. Boots soak faster. Cloaks get dirtier. People complain more. Yet, with less despair in it, complaint in thaw sounds almost cheerful compared to complaint in deep winter. The animals change too. Their coats shift. Their impatience becomes forward-looking rather than trapped. They test fences, push at gates, nose the air. A household that has spent months thinking inward now begins cautiously to think outward. That shift touches everyone. The old man by the hearth carves less and watches the door more. The woman at the spindle still spins, but with less urgency. Children ask when they can sleep without all the extra blankets. No one answers directly because spring in the north is a trickster. But the very asking means something has already changed. Then comes one of those evenings that would be easy to miss if you were not living in the body of the season itself. The fire is going, the room is warm enough, people are where they ought to be. But through the smoke hole and the seam of the door comes a quality of air unlike any air you have breathed in months. Damp, soft, carrying earth beneath it, not warm, no, not by any generous standard, yet no longer sharpened into hostility. The whole house seems to notice. A conversation falters. Someone lifts their head. The old woman nearest the hearth smiles without explaining why. The next day the drip from the roof does not stop. It becomes rhythm, then music, then proof. Children run out simply to stand in the wet and return shouting that the yard is sinking. Men go to the edges of paths and stamp at the old drifts to test their weakness. Women hang cloth longer in the air and judge by smell and weight whether proper drying will soon be possible again. A dog finds an old bone under the melt and acts as if winter personally buried it as a gift. The Longhouse, which has been the whole world for so long, begins to feel like a house again rather than a fortress. This is where memory softens what endurance made harsh. Even before spring fully arrives, the mind begins rearranging winter into story. The worst nights become singular. The hardest chores become almost noble in recollection. The quarrels lose their bite. The bowls of stew shine warmer. The stories told at the hearth seem wiser. That is not falsehood. It is the brain's ancient skill at turning survival into meaning. So the next season can be faced without despair already winning. You look around the room now and see winter's evidence everywhere. Patched sleeves, blackened beams, extra pegs added where wet things dried all season. Spoons carved during dark afternoons. A new section of wall packed more thickly where the storm found weakness. Boots repaired so many times they could almost be called new by persistence alone. Nothing in the house is untouched by the season, but nothing has been taken beyond use either. That is its own victory, and so, when the thaw truly begins and the household allows itself to believe, the understanding comes in full. Viking winter survival was not built on hardness alone. Hardness mattered, courage mattered, stubbornness mattered. But the real engine was interdependence expressed through ordinary acts. Architecture, cloth, food stores, fire discipline, storytelling, hospitality, ritual, childcare, animal care, repair, memory. These are not side notes to survival. They are survival. A Viking might dream of fame in summer, of ships and steel and songs carrying a name outward over water. But winter strips a culture to the terms on which it actually continues. And on those terms, the greatest achievements are often quiet. A roof that does not fail. A child who reaches spring. A food store stretched just far enough. A sick person who recovers. A fire that is never lost. A household that emerges tired, smoke-stung, patched, and still recognizably itself. That is the beauty of the Longhouse when the season finally loosens. Not that it looked grand, it did not. Not that it was comfortable. It was not, by any indulgent standard, But it held. In a world trying patiently to reduce all things to silence and cold, the house held. The people held one another. The stories held the mind. The work held the days together until light became trustworthy again. Now, as evening gathers, you sit once more near the fire with a blanket over your knees and listen to the softer world beyond the wall. Water? Not much. Just enough. A different sound than wind. A different future than the one deep winter seemed determined to enforce. The room smells of broth, wet wool, smoke, and a little mud drying near the door. You would never have thought mud could smell hopeful, yet here it is. Someone close to sleep drops a spoon. A child murmurs and turns. The dog stretches so deeply it seems to become all legs for a moment, then collapses again beneath the bench. The embers shift. The longhouse breathes around you, no longer under siege in quite the same way, though still careful, still practiced, still itself. You have moved through the whole season here, from the tight animal heat of the first dark morning to this gentler edge where survival begins to blur into continuation. Outside, the north remains wide, old, and beyond any one household's power. Inside, the little human answer continues in all its smoky tenderness. The house holds, the fire holds, the people hold, and now, with winter finally loosening its hand from the roof, the yard, the paths, and your own tired body, sleep can hold you too, slow and heavy as warm wool settling over the shoulders of someone who has made it all the way through.